Hi everyone, today we're at Fistral Beach down in Cornwall. Fistral Beach is on the north shore, and what you can see on screen now is pretty much the view that I'm going to be painting today. I actually did 3 or maybe 4 paintings on this day, I can't quite remember, but I'll put them up at the end of the video anyway so that you can see all the work that I did. So just taking a little walk down the beach at the moment into the surf, partly to give you a feel for what the beach is like, but also just to fill up my water bottle. So if I'm painting near a river or the sea, then I really like to use the seawater or the river water. I kind of like the idea that a little bit of the environment goes into the painting. Now the view you can see here, you can see there's a hotel on the right up on the cliff, and then to the left there was, it's just gone off screen now, but there was a little hill. And I also painted that scene later in the day as well. So, the sun's come out a little bit. I've got my field easel set up. If you're interested in getting a field easel, the one I use is the Winsor & Newton one. I think it cost me about 25 quid, something like that. I got it from the range, but I'm sure it's available on the web. Obviously, Winsor & Newton is it's a massive company, so their products are really easy to get hold of. But this little easel, it will hold a surprisingly large canvas actually, and it's lightweight. It collapses down. You can set it up at different angles and stuff. So I find it really good to use. I use it at home as well sometimes, but when you're outside, it's great. So I've actually got this easel propped up on a little pile of sand, and I've used some large pebbles to weigh it down as well. And as you can see, the sun has come out, and I'm at the moment just putting in some layers of blue to represent the sky and the sea, keeping my brush strokes fairly horizontal. So one of the main techniques I use when painting sea is to layer different colours. So for example, I might use Silurian blue, and then over the top of that some cobalt blue, maybe even some ultramarine, and I've just added some magenta to the sea a few seconds ago. And the colour of the water down in Cornwall, it's really, it's a classic thing for artists to say that the way the light bounces off the water, it's one of the main attractions of the area for artists, and it's why there are so many artists in that part of the world. There's often a purple hue to the water down at Fistral, and I'm not quite sure why. Sometimes there is a stormy sky and it reflects, the purple of the clouds reflect in the water, but today, as you can see, it's a nice clear day, but there's still quite a purple hue to the water. So it's beautiful, but a little bit unusual. What I'm doing now is using some slightly darker versions of the blues that I've used to put in some of the reflections on the sand. And then, having done that, over the top, I'm popping in some sort of more sand-like colours with a smaller flat brush. As you can see, I'm filming today with a little GoPro style camera, and this is actually attached to my head, so you can see what I'm looking at as the video progresses. It does mean, however, the painting is perhaps a little smaller on screen than I would like, certainly compared to the studio videos that I do. But I hope this at least gives you a feel for what it's like to paint outside, sat on the beach. So now I'm starting to put in some of the distant cliffs there on the left, and I'm doing this by putting in the lighter colours first, so perhaps a little bit difficult to see on screen, but the hillside is a combination of, it's got grass there, but there are some reds and oranges showing through. We've had fairly hot weather in the southwest recently, so some of the grass has been bleached orangey, so I'm just kind of putting in a mix of colours and blending some of those colours as I go. One of the great things about this location is that the tide goes so far out and comes so far in through the course of the day that and the lighting conditions obviously change, as they do everywhere. So if you stay at the beach for, a few hours, you can get to paint several different scenes. Obviously you can look to the left, as I am at the moment, down the coast. I also, as I mentioned earlier, I did a painting looking the other way up the beach. So there's like a hillside with a little white hut on top, and I included that. Or sometimes I just paint the water with the waves crashing in. Sometimes I'll go and stand in the sea and paint the view looking along the shoreline. Other times I'll stand in the shallows and paint the view looking back up the beach. But having popped in the warmer colours on the cliffs on the painting, I'm now coming in with some cooler colours. And although, you might be tempted to think of rocks and things being brown in colour, which of course they are, I try to avoid the neutral colours in my painting, certainly in the early stages, and try to keep things fairly primary or secondary. So I will work with blues and reds and purples and oranges before I'll go to browns. And it's not that I won't ever use a brown. In fact, I've done quite a lot of monochrome work where it's almost purely brown. But for this, I want to kind of pick out the colours and give a sense of the environment I'm in. And one of the things that really strikes me down on the coast of Cornwall is the vibrancy of the colours. So that's why I'm using that style of painting. Now there's like a little island off the edge of the cliff that you can see there on the horizon. So I've just included that silhouette, and now I'm going back to the main part of the cliff. I'm putting in some warmer orangey tones now. So years ago I used to use several brushes in my work, and I'd often end up with 6, 7 or 8 brushes on the go. And I used to find I got into like a bit of a muddle. So over the years I've, generally speaking, simplified things and tend to only use 2 or 3 brushes, sometimes only 1 brush if I can get away with it. You do have to clean that brush more carefully sometimes, but for me, I find I can work a lot quicker and more efficiently, and it forces me to think, well, if I've got some blue on my brush, where can I use this on the painting before I wash the brush out? And certainly when I'm working outside and I've had to carry a lot of equipment, from the car park along the beach, it's good to be efficient and sort of, keep things as lightweight as possible. So I'm using a dry brush technique now over the background of the sea that I'd put down earlier to begin to describe a wave. And in the same way that if you've seen any of my animal painting videos, I kind of curve the brush strokes around the body of the animal to describe the contours. I'm using a similar technique with the wave now as well. Now, one of the ways to create highlights or a sense of shimmering light on water is once you've put down your background layers, your main blocks of colour, you can put just a little bit of paint of your highlight colour, perhaps a light blue or a light gold, or maybe even just pure white, but have very, very little on the brush, and then just very lightly drag that across the dry underlayer of acrylic, and that will just deposit just the faintest sort of speckled layer over the top. And that's a nice way to create highlights on water, in particular on distant water though.
Jeez, there's a huge bee next to me. Jesus. Oh my God. Look at the size of this thing.
Now there's that bee. Look at the size of that thing. That was a massive bee. It may not come across on camera, but trust me, that bee was the size of a small dog. So these are the things we have to deal with when we're painting outside. You may remember a video from a couple of weeks ago where I was interrupted by a seagull, and I actually ended up sketching the seagull. My eyesight is not quite sharp enough to draw a bee in flight, unfortunately. But anyway, back to the painting. So I'm putting in some deeper layers of shadow on the waves now. And when painting waves, of course, you're painting something which, the body of water is moving the entire time. The waves are constantly rolling in. So you have to, look at what you're drawing or painting and make some decisions about what type of wave do I want to include, because there are an infinite number of styles and shapes and directions that you could include. You've got to sort of think, well, what do I want for this particular painting? Do I want dramatic waves, or do I want quite calm waves coming in? Which direction do I want those? How does it work best for my composition? So I'm using a deeper blue now to pick out some of the darker shadows on the distant cliffs. Now, when it comes to working outside, if I have a choice, just in general, I like to work pretty big, A2 or even ideally A1 in size. A2 is what I work on mostly. Working outdoors, I wouldn't say I never do that, but in general I will go down to A3, which is the size I'm working on now. It's not ideal for the way I like to paint. I like to use my whole arm and kind of do great sweeping brush strokes if I get the choice. However, this A3 is a good compromise for outside work. It's small enough to be easily portable. It's small enough that you can get a complete painting done in a relatively short time. It doesn't catch the wind too much, especially if you use an art board, which is what I'm painting on today. So it's a rigid support. But it is still big enough to be reasonably expressive. And when I'm painting seascapes or landscapes, in the same way that when I'm painting animals, whether the reference is a photograph or from real life, while I definitely use those references to structure the painting and create the painting, after a while I am doing my own thing. So every image I produce, it's definitely inspired by the view from the beach here, but I'm not looking to represent it photographically. I'm just looking to create something of my own. So what I'm doing at the moment is just popping in some highlights on the waves. And generally the way I will do this is to not use pure white. I'll go in with perhaps a light blue or a very light yellow, maybe even a light purple or a grey, and I'll describe the foam by rolling the brush and putting the brush down at different angles. And then on top of that subdued layer, of subdued colour, I'll then put in perhaps a few dashes of pure white to pick out the real highlights. So I'm using layers in my shadows, light shadows, medium shadows, very dark shadows, and then I'm taking the same approach with highlights. So I'll have kind of darker highlights and then medium highlights and then very, very bright highlights as well. Now just very lightly moving the brush edge on along the painting to pick out some highlights of the water, the shallow water just lapping in. So one of the really cool things that I've gained from making videos on YouTube is that it gives me a real opportunity to objectively review my own work while it's being created. So, before I was videoing, obviously I would paint and then I'd step back and have a look at the painting and maybe even put it away, come back to it, and then look at the finished thing. But obviously you can't see in real time decisions that you made. And you're rewatching this footage, I'm thinking to myself, as I watch it now, I'm thinking, well, actually, I could have stopped this painting, maybe a minute on from where I am now. I decided not to. I worked up the foreground a little bit more. And the reason I did that was I felt there perhaps wasn't quite enough sense of depth in the painting as it is. But there's a sort of gentleness and delicacy to the foreground, which I really quite like in its current version. And what you're about to see is I actually put in some bolder colours on this painting in the foreground on the sand. And what I really wish is I kept both versions, really. So I really wish I'd had the foresight to stop at this stage and perhaps photograph the work exactly as it is now, and keep that as a digital version to offer as a print or something on my website. And then also I could have then gone on as I did and continued working. So in the same way I just used the brush edge on before to put in some highlights, I've just put in some minor shadows, and now I'm just picking out some highlights on the distant water where the waves are lapping up against the rocks off in the distance there. So as you can see, if you look at the view, the sand starts off quite a light colour, and then it goes a darker sand colour, and then it goes into the wet sand. So what I'm putting in now is the sort of darker dry sand colour. And as I said, I'm doing that because I feel I need to give the foreground a little more strength so that the cliffs and the water look a little more distant. But seriously, if you haven't ever done so and you get the opportunity to do a painting at the beach, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's so much fun, it's so relaxing, and you can't beat painting from life. Photographs are great for reference, video is good for reference, but it isn't the same as painting from life. And what I find is that if I go out and paint from life, it improves the paintings that I do when I am just working from photos. So here's the dry brush technique that I mentioned earlier. I'm just dragging a light colour horizontally across the underlayer of water to create some shimmering light on the distant sea there. And this constant dialogue between sort of artist and environment when you're painting outside, especially with a beach environment, because although I'm working fairly quickly, what if this painting's taken well, it's 20 minutes on the video, but it's probably nearer 40 minutes in reality because I've edited out a lot of the colour mixing I've done. But even in that relatively short time, obviously the shoreline has changed. The tide has moved, the patches of wet sand that were there before are not there now. So the observations you make at the start of your painting will be somewhat different to the ones that you make towards the end. So you have to kind of make decisions as you go and think, well, am I going to stick with my earlier observation, or am I now going to make observations based on what I see currently? And it's a balancing act, basically. So there's an image of the final painting. So a couple of waves crashing in and the distant headland there. And what I'll do is I'll also put up, as I mentioned earlier, I'll put up the images of the other paintings I did that day. So one is of just the ocean waves crashing in. So here's that one. So with this one I really concentrated on picking out all the wide range of colours that I saw. And then the third one is the view in the other direction up the beach. So that includes the headland popping out into the sea with like a little white hut on the peak of the headland. And again, you know, waves crashing in and so on. Okay, so I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to hit the like button. Please remember to subscribe and hit the notifications bell. Any questions at all, please remember to just leave me a comment below the video. And I will leave you for the last few seconds with some footage of the beautiful Fistral Beach as, you know, evening draws in. Okay, thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you next week.